The gun was already pressed against his temple when she said the words that stopped him cold. "Please, my daughter is asking for you." Mason Dade had survived ambushes in 3 territories, outrun bounty hunters across 2 state lines, and kept himself alive through 9 years of hard drifting by trusting exactly one instinct, the instinct to run. He had been running when the man behind him caught up. He was still running in spirit, even now, even with the cold steel kissing his skull and the hot Arizona sun burning the back of his neck. He was always already gone before a place could claim him, but those words, those particular, impossible words. He turned his head slowly, because a man with a gun pressed to his skull learns to move slowly, or he learns nothing ever again, and he looked at her across the dusty width of the jail cell corridor. Hannah Crawford stood in the shadow of the doorway with her hands clasped at her waist, and her jaw set in the particular way he had come to recognize as her version of begging, because Hannah Crawford did not beg. She had not begged when the bank threatened her land. She had not begged when the town turned cold shoulders to her. She had not begged him, not once in the 3 weeks he had been here, not even when she'd had every reason to. But she was begging now. And the man with the gun, Deputy Carl Whitmore, a thick-necked weasel in a lawman's badge, pressed the barrel harder against Mason's skull and said, "He's not going anywhere, Mrs. Crawford. This man is wanted in 2 counties." "He's wanted," Hannah said quietly, and her eyes never left Mason's, "by a 6-year-old girl who cannot sleep and who has been asking for the man who reads her stories since the moment she heard they had locked him up." Something cracked open in Mason Dade's chest. Not the gun, not the threat, not the legal machinery of 1882, Arizona bearing down on him. Something older than all of that. Something he had spent 9 years running from, and he thought with terrible clarity that maybe this was how running ended. Not with a bullet, not with a noose, but with a woman looking at you across a dark corridor like you were worth saving, and a child somewhere in the night asking for you by name. He had been in Redemption Creek for 23 days when all of this began to collapse around him. He had not meant to stay that long. He never meant to stay anywhere. Mason Dade was 31 years old and had been drifting since he was 22. Since the night in Tucson when everything he had built and loved and believed himself to be had been taken from him in a single act of betrayal so complete that it had hollowed him out like a drought hollows out a riverbed, leaving only the shape of where water used to run. He traveled light. A bedroll, a rifle, a horse named Dorado who was getting too old for the miles they put on him, and a battered copy of Grimm's fairy tales that had belonged to his mother, and that he had never once been able to bring himself to leave behind even as he abandoned everything else. He had ridden into Redemption Creek on a Wednesday in late September with no intention beyond watering his horse, buying dried beans, and moving on before anyone could learn his name. The town sat in a shallow valley in the Superstition foothills, red rock and scrub oak, and a single main street that baked under the sun with the patient misery of every small western town that had never quite become what it hoped to be. There was a general store, a livery stable, a saloon called the Copper Nail, a church with a crooked steeple, a 2-room schoolhouse that appeared to be on the verge of structural failure, and a small jail that smelled of tobacco and old desperation. He tied Dorado at the trough outside the general store and went in for his beans. That was where he first saw her. Hannah Crawford was arguing with a man behind the counter, and she was losing the argument the way strong people lose arguments, without conceding a single word, simply absorbing the injustice of it with a spine so straight it looked like it had been poured from iron. The man behind the counter was Gerald Potts, who owned the store and, as Mason would later learn, a controlling share of the town's collective opinion. Potts was refusing to extend her credit, and he was doing it with the particular brand of cruelty that passes for business sense in small towns, loudly, in front of 3 other customers, so that everyone could witness the widow Crawford being put back in her place. "Your account is $30 past due," Potts said. "I have a business to run." "My harvest comes in at the end of October," Hannah said. Her voice was controlled. She was not embarrassed, and that, Mason thought, was what infuriated Potts most of all, that she refused to perform the shame he wanted from her. 6 weeks, Gerald. I am asking for 6 weeks. The answer is no." She stood for a moment with a sack of flour she had already lifted, and then she set it down on the counter with a precision that contained all the rage and grief she would not otherwise let out, and she turned and walked out of the store. Mason bought his beans. And then, on an impulse he could not fully explain even to himself, he bought a sack of flour, 2 pounds of salt pork, a tin of molasses, and a small bag of hard candies, and he carried them out to where she was unhitching her horse from the post in front of the store. "I don't need charity," she said, without turning around because she had heard his boots behind her. "I know," he said. "I'm leaving these in the street then, whoever wants them." She turned. She looked at him for a long moment, with those dark brown eyes that took things in without giving anything back, the eyes of a woman who had learned that being fully seen was a risk she could not afford. She was, he guessed, 28, maybe 29. She had dark hair pinned back and flour dust on her sleeve from some earlier baking, and a smudge of axle grease on her chin that she was unaware of. And she looked simultaneously like someone who had been carrying too much for too long, and like someone who would carry it indefinitely rather than set it down. "You're passing through," she said. "Yes, madam." "Then I'll accept it as a kindness from a stranger I'll never see again," she said, "and I won't have to feel beholden." He loaded the supplies into her wagon without another word. She drove away without looking back. He told himself he was leaving. He did not leave. He could not entirely account for why. Dorado had a stone bruise on his left foreleg that needed rest. That was true, and he paid for 3 nights at the livery with his last good silver dollar. He ate at the small boarding house run by a gaunt woman named Mrs. Fitch, who charged 40 cents for supper and asked no questions, which he appreciated. He sat on the porch in the evenings and watched the town settle into dark, and told himself he would leave in the morning. On the second day, he heard about the Crawford land. The story spread through the Copper Nail like smoke, the way all small town stories spread in pieces, each piece delivered by someone who wanted you to know they were important enough to have the information. What he gathered, between the gaps and the embellishments, was this. Hannah Crawford's husband, Daniel Crawford, had died 14 months ago of a rattlesnake bite, which was not heroic or dramatic, but was simply the sudden and stupid way that death came to working men in the territory. He had left behind Hannah and their daughter Lily, who was 5 at the time and was now 6. He had also left behind 160 acres of decent grazing land with a small house, and a creek that ran reliable water 10 months of the year. And he had left behind a debt to a man named Harlan Voss. Harlan Voss was not from Redemption Creek, but he had inserted himself into the town's economy the way a tick inserts itself into flesh, quietly and deeply, and with a patience that was almost admirable if you could stand to admire it. He owned the water rights to the main canal that fed 3 farms on the north side of the valley, including Hannah's. The debt Daniel Crawford had owed him was $60, which was not a catastrophic sum. But Voss had been compounding interest on it at a rate that bordered on fraudulent, and the total had grown to $140, and Voss had made it quietly, persistently known that he wanted that land more than he wanted the money. "She's got until the 1st of November, said the man sitting next to Mason at the bar, a sun-dried cowhand named Pete who had no last name that anyone used. "After that, Voss files with the territorial court and she's out. Her and that little girl both." Mason drank his whiskey. "That legal?" Pete shrugged in the way of a man who has watched injustice operate for long enough that he no longer distinguishes it from weather. "Legal enough out here." Mason put down his glass and walked out. He rode out to the Crawford property the next morning because he told himself he was just satisfying a curiosity, just mapping the lay of the land the way a man who might be passing through maps things. The house was small and clean, with a kitchen garden that had been worked with real care, beans and squash and late-season tomatoes on their stakes. There was a chicken coop and a small barn and a corral with 2 horses, both of them older but well kept. The land itself was good, rolling gently toward the creek, and through the scrub and mesquite you could see where it would be in better circumstances, genuinely beautiful. He pulled Dorado up at the fence line and was considering turning back when the door of the house opened and a small girl came out onto the porch. She was 6 years old, and she had her mother's dark eyes and a wild cloud of black hair that had not yet been introduced to a brush that morning. And she looked at him across the yard with the absolute fearlessness that belongs only to small children who have not yet learned that strangers are a category requiring suspicion. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he said. "What is your horse's name, Dorado?" She considered this with the gravity of a judge. "That is a good name," she said. "My horse is named Biscuit. Do you want to see Biscuit, Lily?" Hannah's voice came from the doorway, quiet but carrying. "Come inside." The girl, Lily, turned and went in, but she looked over her shoulder at him once with an expression of pure, uncomplicated curiosity, as though she had simply filed him away for later and intended to return to the subject. Hannah stood in the doorway with her arms crossed, not hostile exactly, but watchful. "I don't know why you're here," she said. "Checking on Dorado's leg," he said. "The road takes me past." "It doesn't actually," she said. "The road to anywhere takes you through town." He had nothing to say to that because it was true. "I heard about Voss," he said, her jaw tightened. "Half this territory has heard about Voss. Hearing hasn't stopped anything." "I have some experience with water rights disputes," he said, which was true. Before Tucson. Before everything fell apart. He had worked for 2 years as a land surveyor, and before that he had read law for a year under a judge in Santa Fe, a fact he mentioned to almost no one because it felt like describing a life that had belonged to someone else. There are arguments that can be made. The compounding interest rate he's using may not hold up under territorial statute. She stared at him. "You're a drifter." "Yes, madam. Drifters don't know territorial statute. This one does." A long pause. The morning was quiet around them, just the wind in the mesquite and the sound of Lily moving around inside the house and somewhere the restless clucking of the chickens. "Come inside," Hannah said finally, in a voice that made it clear this was not warmth, this was pragmatism. "I have coffee." The coffee was strong and good. The kitchen was scrubbed clean, and there were books on a shelf near the window, which surprised him, not because women didn't read, but because the shelf was serious. There was a surveying almanac and a book on territorial law and 3 volumes of history, and a dog-eared collection of poetry by someone named Emily Dickinson. He looked at the shelf a moment too long. "My husband believed in books," she said, watching him. "So do I." "So do I," he said, which was the first fully honest thing he had said to anyone in years. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway holding a cloth doll and studying him with those dark eyes. "Mama," she said, "the man has a book in his saddlebag. I saw it when he came in." "That's private, Lily." "It is," Mason agreed, looking at the girl, "but she has good eyes." "What kind of book?" Lily asked. "Stories," he said. "Fairy tales." The girl's eyes went wide. This was clearly the correct answer, possibly the best answer anyone had given to any question she had ever asked. She climbed into the chair across from him without being invited and put her elbows on the table. "Read me one," she said. "Lily," Hannah said, starting to object. "It's all right," Mason said, and he meant it, in a way that surprised him, because it had been a very long time since anything had been all right. He went to his saddlebag and brought in the Grimms, battered and soft, spined from years of being carried, and he sat back down at the table and opened it to a story about a girl who was braver than everyone expected her to be, and he read. He read it slowly, and he did it right, with the voices and the pauses, the way his mother had read to him in a house in Missouri that was gone now, the way everything from before was gone. And Lily sat across from him with her chin on her fists and her eyes enormous. And Hannah stood by the wood stove pretending to tend the fire but not moving the poker once. And the morning light came through the kitchen window and lay in strips across the table. When he finished, Lily exhaled a long breath of pure satisfaction. "Again," she said. "Lily," Hannah said. "Another time," Mason said, looking at the girl, and then, before he could stop himself, at her mother. "Maybe another time." He did not leave that day, or the next. The following week he fixed the fence along the creek, because he noticed it was failing and he had nothing better to do. He helped Hannah pull the last of the summer vegetables before the frost could take them. He patched the hole in the barn roof where the last rain had come through. He did these things without being asked, and without expecting anything, and Hannah accepted them in the same spirit they were offered, practically, as one neighbor might accept another's help, with a nod and a cup of coffee and no particular fuss. But every morning, Lily came and found him. Every morning, at some point, she appeared at his elbow wherever he was working, with the Grimms in her arms, and looked at him with those expectant dark eyes, and he would sit with her on the porch steps or under the big cottonwood by the creek, and he would read. He read her the story of the fisherman's wife, and the story of the 12 dancing princesses, and the story about Rumpelstiltskin, which she found delightfully ridiculous. He read her Hans the Hedgehog, which she declared was sad and strange and her very favorite. He read to her while Hannah worked in the garden 20 yards away and pretended not to listen, though he could tell by the set of her shoulders when something in the story moved her. It was during the 3rd week that Hannah began to talk to him. Not about Voss, not about the land, not about practical things. She began to talk to him in the evenings after Lily was in bed, sitting on the porch in the cooling dark with a tin cup of coffee each, about smaller things and then, gradually, about larger ones. She told him about the town she had grown up in, farther west, a mining camp that had died when the silver ran out and left behind only foundations and broken glass. She told him about how she had learned to read from a woman who came through offering lessons in exchange for meals, a traveling schoolteacher who had changed her life, and whom she had never seen again. She told him about Daniel, carefully and honestly, without performance, that he had been a good man and a patient one, and that she had loved him in the way you love the earth you stand on, not with fire but with a deep, abiding gratitude for its solidity. "And then the ground was gone," she said once, and did not elaborate, and he understood. He told her very little about himself. He told her about Missouri and about the surveying and about Dorado, who had been a gift from a rancher outside Flagstaff in exchange for 2 months of fence work. He did not tell her about Tucson. He did not tell her about the thing that had broken him, the betrayal that had set him running, and that he carried like a wound that never quite closed. She did not push. She was not that kind of woman. She offered him her own truths, and she let him keep his secrets, and she watched him with those dark eyes that took everything in and returned nothing. And he understood by the end of the second week that she was the most interesting person he had encountered in 9 years of drifting. He also understood, with the clarity of someone who has spent a long time being honest with themselves about why they cannot have things, that he was beginning to feel for her something he had no right to feel, something that was going to become a problem. The problem arrived in the form of Harlan Voss, who came to the property on a Tuesday morning with 2 men behind him, and a self-satisfied smile that had probably never been attractive and had only worsened with time. Voss was in his mid-40s, wide in the shoulders and narrow in the eyes, with the particular confidence of a man who had learned that money was a kind of persuasion that required no charm. Mason was mending the corral gate when they rode up. Voss looked at him for a moment, calculating. "You work for the widow. I'm a neighbor," Mason said. "You're nobody I recognize," Voss said. "That makes 2 of us," Mason said pleasantly. Voss's eyes went flat. He looked past Mason toward the house, where Hannah had come out onto the porch. "Mrs. Crawford," Voss called. "I've come to give you a final opportunity to discuss terms." "Your terms haven't changed," Hannah said from the porch. "Neither has my answer." "My terms," Voss said, riding closer, ignoring Mason entirely now, "are very generous, all things considered. I'll clear the debt entirely and give you $60 on top of the purchase price, which is more than fair for land with a creek. You and your girl could go somewhere comfortable." "I am somewhere comfortable," Hannah said. "This is my home. For another 3 weeks." The 2 men behind Voss shifted their horses, just slightly, just enough to be a language, and the language said that there were 2 of them and they were armed, and they were not here by accident. Mason set down his tools and walked around the corral to the fence line nearest Voss's horse. "The compounding interest clause in the original lending agreement," Mason said, conversationally, as though they were discussing the weather, "is in violation of Section 44 of the Territorial Lending Ordinance, which places a ceiling of 8% per annum on private debt instruments. Your rate has been running at nearly 22%. A territorial court would reduce the principal owed to under $40, and Mrs. Crawford has $40. Voss turned his horse sharply to look at Mason. Something moved in his eyes, something that was not quite surprise but was the thing that comes just before surprise, a recalculation. "Who are you?" Voss said. "Someone passing through," Mason said, "who knows a great deal about territorial lending law." The silence stretched. One of the men behind Voss shifted his horse again. The other one had his hand resting near his holster, not on it, but near it, which was its own statement. "I'll be back," Voss said to Hannah, and then he looked at Mason in a way that was both a promise and a warning, and he turned his horse and rode back down the road with his 2 men behind him. Hannah came down from the porch. She stood beside Mason at the fence line and watched until the riders disappeared into the scrub. "Is that true?" she said. "What you told him about the lending ordinance?" "Yes," he said. "I'll need to see the original documents, but I believe it's true." She turned to look at him, and this time her expression was different. Not the watchful, careful assessment of the previous weeks. Something more open, something more afraid. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He thought about the honest answer for a moment. The honest answer was complicated and involved things he was not ready to say. About how her daughter had found some lever in him that he had believed was rusted permanently shut, and how Hannah herself had found another, and how standing here on this particular piece of ground with these particular people felt more like being alive than anything had in 9 years. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said, which was true, just not complete. She looked at him for a long moment with those eyes that took everything in, and then she nodded once and went back to the house, and he went back to mending the gate. That night, after Lily was in bed and they were on the porch with their coffee, Hannah said, out of the blue and into the dark, "You said you were passing through." "I did say that," he agreed. "You said that the first day you came here, I know. That was 3 weeks ago." "Yes." She didn't say anything more. Neither did he. But something had been acknowledged, and the night felt different after that, as though the air had shifted, as though they were both standing slightly closer to something that had no name yet. It was the next day that Voss made his move, and it was not the move Mason had expected. The charge was fraudulent representation, which Voss had apparently drawn up with impressive speed, claiming that Mason Dade had been operating as a legal representative without license in the territory of Arizona, which was, to be fair, technically true in the narrow sense that he had not been licensed. Deputy Whitmore arrived at the Crawford property just after noon with 2 other men and a warrant, and Mason, who had not run from a lawman in years, and who had made an instinctive calculation about what running would cost Hannah, went quietly. The jail in Redemption Creek was 1 room with 2 cells and smelled of old tobacco and the particular despair of a place where men had waited for things they did not want to wait for. Mason sat in the cell and thought about the situation with a calm that surprised him slightly. He had faced worse. But he had faced worse alone, and this was different because the consequences of this were not only his. It was in the jail, in the 2 days that followed, that he finally told someone about Tucson. The someone was a man named Everett Hobbs, who occupied the other cell and was being held for public drunkenness, and who was, under the alcohol and the hard years, a fundamentally decent man. Everett had asked him what a man who clearly knew something about the law was doing in a place like this, and Mason had said he was passing through, and Everett had laughed and said that was the oldest lie in the territory. And then Mason had told him, Tucson, 1873. He had been 22, working as a junior surveyor under a man named Richard Allard, who was brilliant and dishonest in the precise combination that produces great success and great ruin. Mason had been in love for the first and until now only time with a woman named Clara who worked as a school teacher and who had hair like autumn and a laugh that could change the temperature of a room. He had trusted both of them completely. Allard had been falsifying survey records, filing fraudulent claims on behalf of a mining company that paid him very well to make certain land appear to be in certain places it wasn't, which had enormous implications for water rights and mineral rights and the lives of the farming families whose land was being reclassified. Mason had found out. He had told Clara because he told Clara everything, because she was the person he trusted most in the world. Clara had told Allard. She had been working for Allard, had been paid to work for Allard, had been, in the most precise and devastating sense, a trap that he had walked into with complete willingness, because he was 22 and in love, and had not yet learned that those 2 conditions make you maximally vulnerable to exactly this kind of betrayal. Allard had Mason arrested on a fabricated charge of fraud, which took 3 months and most of Mason's savings to fight off, by which time Allard had moved his operation to New Mexico, and Clara had gone with him. Mason had been cleared, but cleared meant nothing when the reputation was already shredded, and the relationship that had been his whole world was revealed as a performance designed to keep him manageable, and then dispose of him when he became inconvenient. He had started drifting 3 weeks after the charges were dropped. He had not stopped. Everett Hobbs listened to all of this and then was quiet for a while. "That's a heavy thing to carry," Everett said. "Yes," Mason said. "The woman out there, Everett said carefully. The widow Crawford. Is she anything like the one in Tucson? Mason thought about that for a long time. No, he said. She is almost nothing like her. On the third morning, Hannah came. He heard her voice first outside, arguing with Whitmore, who was a man of limited intelligence but significant stubbornness, which in a deputy was worse than being simply cruel. Mason stood at the door of his cell and listened to her systematically dismantle every justification Whitmore offered, point by point, with the careful precision of someone who had read every relevant section of a law book before she came. She had been reading. She had been preparing. She had done this for him. And then the final argument, the one that Whitmore couldn't counter, not because it was legal but because it was true and because Whitmore, for all his limitations, was not entirely without a heart. My daughter is asking for you. Mason heard those words and felt the crack he described, that split in the armor he had been building for 9 years. And what came through it was not pain exactly, but was the thing that is on the other side of pain. The thing you feel when you have been numb for a long time, and something finally wakes you up. Whitmore let him go. Not with grace, not with any acknowledgement that he had been used by Voss as a tool, but he let him go because the charge was thin and because a little girl asking for a man to come read to her was the kind of fact that made certain things feel very small. Mason walked out of the jail into the afternoon light, and Hannah was there, 2 steps away, and Lily was there too, right behind her mother, clutching her cloth doll and looking at him with those enormous eyes. You came, Lily said, as though this were perfectly expected. I came, he agreed. He did not look at Hannah immediately. He was afraid of what he would see, afraid it would be too much to hold right now. But then he did look, and what he saw was not the thing he feared. It was not gratitude exactly, or relief, or any of the emotions he would have expected. What he saw was something simpler and more frightening. She was glad he was there, not glad in a useful or practical way, just glad. The way you are glad when something you have been worried about not having turns out to be present after all. He thought he had better be very careful. He was not careful. That evening on the porch he told her about Tucson. He had not planned to. It simply came out, the way things come out after you have been holding them long enough, not in a rush but steadily, like water finding the crack. He told her about Allard and about Clara, and about the betrayal, and about the 3 months in a cell fighting a charge that was designed to destroy him, and about the particular kind of damage that comes not from failure or loss, but from having your trust used as a weapon against you. Hannah listened without interruption. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment in the dark. How old were you? She said. 22. You've been running since you were 22, yes. And you're 31. Yes. 9 years, she said softly. 9 years. She turned her coffee cup in her hands. The night was cold now, and the stars over the desert were extravagant, ridiculous, the kind of sky that only exists in places where the light of civilization has not yet drowned them out. I want you to understand something, she said slowly, choosing each word with the care she applied to everything. I am not going to pretend that I don't see what has been happening between us over these past weeks, because I think you deserve honesty, and because pretending would be insulting to both of us. She paused. I am also not going to pretend that my situation is simple, or that what I need from you and what I want from you are the same thing, because they are not, and I am not going to confuse the two. He looked at her. The starlight was just enough to see her face. What do you need? He asked. Help with Voss, she said, which you have already been providing, which I am grateful for. And what do you want? He said, and his voice was very quiet, a long pause. I think you know, she said, and she looked away, out across the dark land at the creek that caught the moonlight in pieces. And I think you're terrified of it for the same reasons I'm terrified of it. He was. He absolutely was. Because he had loved once and been made a fool of, and the experience had not merely hurt him, it had restructured him. It had taught him that love was a door that opened onto an ambush, and he had spent 9 years making sure he never stood near that door again. But he was standing near it now. He could not pretend otherwise. "Hannah," he said. "Don't," she said gently. "Not tonight, just let's not tonight," he nodded. They sat in the dark and drank their cooling coffee, and neither of them said anything more. And it was one of the most intimate hours he had experienced in years. That shared silence, that mutual understanding of a thing that was happening between them that neither of them quite had the courage for yet. The courage came, in the end, not through anything dramatic but through a series of small things, the way courage usually arrives. It came through the morning he spent with Hannah going through every paper in Daniel's old wooden box, hunting for the original loan document from Voss. The two of them sitting on opposite sides of the kitchen table with papers spread between them and Lily asleep on her pallet in the next room. And the way their hands touched once over a paper, they both reached for, and neither of them moved their hands away. It came through the afternoon he read to Lily under the cottonwood tree, and looked up at some point to find Hannah watching them with an expression on her face that was unguarded in a way he had never seen from her, open and young, and full of something that ached to see, because it was the expression of a woman allowing herself to want a thing. It came through the night she told him about the loneliness. She told him matter-of-factly, the way she told everything, as a fact rather than a complaint. She told him that the 14 months since Daniel's death had been the most isolated period of her life, not because she lacked industry or purpose, but because there was no one to talk to at the end of the day, no one to share the small victories or the small disasters, no one who knew the texture of her days and cared about them. Lily was everything, and she was not lonely for love, but she was lonely for the kind of companionship that only exists between equals. "I had not realized how much I had missed it," she said, "until you started sitting on this porch." He looked at her then, and she looked at him, and there was a moment that stretched and hummed like a wire pulled tight. "I am not good at staying," he said, because it was true and she deserved to know it. "I know," she said. "You're afraid that's a permanent condition, isn't it?" She shook her head very slowly. "I think you have been staying here for 3 weeks and calling it something else." He had no answer to that. 2 days later he kissed her. He put down the pen. She was looking at the pages, and then she looked up, and he leaned across the corner of the table and kissed her. It was not a tentative kiss. He had not intended it to be tentative. He had been tentative about this for 3 weeks, and he was done with tentative. He kissed her with the full weight of what he felt, which was considerable, and which had been pressing against his ribs for longer than he had admitted to himself. She kissed him back. She kissed him back with a thoroughness and a genuine passion that surprised him slightly, because she had seemed so careful, so controlled, and she was, but she was also someone who, once she made a decision, made it completely. She had decided this. She kissed him like someone who had thought about it and arrived at a conclusion, and was now acting on that conclusion with full conviction. When they separated, she was slightly out of breath, and so was he, which felt like important information. "Well," she said. "Yes," he agreed. They looked at each other across the corner of the table, with the legal papers between them and the lamp burning low and the sounds of the desert night outside, and the world felt very different from how it had felt that morning. "I need you to understand something," he said. "I am listening," she said. "I have been afraid of this, of staying, of letting something matter enough that leaving becomes unthinkable." He paused, organizing the words because they mattered. "And I am still afraid." but I am more afraid of being 60 years old and knowing that I stood in the doorway of this life and chose the road instead." She reached across the papers and covered his hand with hers. "Then don't choose the road," she said simply. He looked at her hand on his. He turned his hand over and held hers. "I'm going to do something about Voss first," he said. "I need to know this is fixed before anything else." "It doesn't have to be fixed for me to want you to stay," she said. "It has to be fixed for me," he said. "I want to give you something certain. I want it to be clean." She nodded. He saw in her face that she understood, that she respected it, even that she loved it slightly. He rode to Phoenix the following week. He was gone for 5 days, which were 5 days in which he thought about Hannah and Lily more or less constantly, and which proved to him, as though proof were needed, that the pattern of his life had fundamentally altered, and the alteration was permanent. The Territorial Land Office was everything he expected. A slow and indifferent machinery staffed by men who regarded their own rules as obstacles to be navigated rather than laws to be enforced. But the argument he and Hannah had built was good, and the documentation was solid, and the interest rate was genuinely and demonstrably illegal under territorial statute. He filed the formal complaint and spoke to a land commissioner named Avery Cole, who was, beneath the bureaucratic indifference, a man of some actual principle, who recognized the illegality immediately and with visible irritation at having been forced to deal with it. Cole issued a formal finding. The debt from the Crawford property to Harlan Voss was recalculated under the legal rate of 8% per annum. The revised total was $38. Hannah Crawford had, as Mason had told Voss, $40. The debt was paid. The threatened foreclosure had no legal basis. Mason rode back to Redemption Creek with the paperwork in his saddlebag, and a feeling in his chest that he identified, with some effort, as something close to joy. He rode up to the Crawford property in the late afternoon of the 5th day. Lily spotted him from the yard before he was through the gate. "Mason." She came running, which was a thing that had not happened before and which undid him entirely, the small girl running toward him with her arms out, and he swung down from Dorado and caught her, and she wrapped her arms around his neck with the complete confidence of a child who has decided that a person is trustworthy and sees no reason to be measured about it. "You came back," she said into his shoulder. "I came back," he said. He looked up, and Hannah was standing on the porch, and her expression was the unguarded one, the one he had only seen a few times, open and young and wanting, and he thought that if he lived to be a very old man he would still be able to see her standing there in the afternoon light, with the desert behind her and the house she had fought to keep behind her and her daughter in his arms. He carried the papers up to the porch and put them in her hands and told her what they said. She read them carefully, with Lily hanging off his arm and asking what each word meant, and when she finished, she put the papers down and pressed both hands over her mouth for a moment, and he watched her fight, very hard, not to cry, because she was not a person who cried easily and she was not going to start now. But she was also a person at the end of 14 months of fighting alone, and the fight was over, and the relief was enormous. She won. She didn't cry. She dropped her hands and looked at him and said, "Thank you. You built the argument," he said. "I just carried it." "You know that's not true," she said. "You know I'm not leaving," he said. In case that was unclear, she smiled. He had discovered over the past weeks, a smile that she deployed rarely and therefore to devastating effect, a smile that started slow and grew, that involved her whole face, that was like the sun coming out from behind a cloud in the particular way that makes you realize how cold it had been. She smiled that smile at him now, and he felt it in his bones. "It was becoming clear," she said. Voss did not go quietly, because men like Voss never did. But he also did not fight the territorial finding, because men like Voss understood when a legal fight had been lost and redirected their energy to places where the resistance was softer. He tried once to approach Mason directly in town with the two men behind him again, and made a series of statements that were intended to convey threat. Mason looked at him with complete calm. "The finding is filed with the territorial court in Phoenix," he said. "Any interference with Mrs. Crawford's property or personage will be added to the record. I spent a year reading law in Santa Fe, and I know exactly how to make that very expensive for you." The two men behind Voss were attentive. Voss himself was, in the end, a businessman, and businessmen calculated costs. He looked at Mason for a long moment, doing his calculation, and then he rode away, and he did not come back. Gerald Potts at the general store was a more complex problem, because Potts controlled access to credit that Hannah needed, and because his attitude toward her was the crystallized form of the town's general skepticism about a woman running a farm alone. But the town's attitude shifted, gradually, as the news of the Voss situation spread, the way news spreads in small towns, which is immediately and completely. Hannah Crawford had fought back. She had found a way. And the man who had helped her, who was now clearly not passing through, had stood up to Voss publicly in a way that no one else had been willing to do. Mason's reputation in Redemption Creek became a thing he had not sought and was not entirely comfortable with, but which served a purpose. He was not menacing about it. He did not cultivate it. But his history, partially known, partially inferred, settled around him in the way that certain men's histories do, as a kind of gravity that people either move toward or around. Potts extended Hannah's credit. The neighbors who had been distant became warmer. The schoolteacher, a worried young woman named Miss Agnes Farr, came to the farm specifically to talk to Hannah about Lily's potential readiness for the upcoming school year. It was during that visit that Miss Farr looked at Mason, who was building a new shelf for the kitchen while the women talked at the table, and said to Hannah with the frank directness of a schoolteacher, "He's going to stay, then." Hannah looked at Mason's back and then at Miss Farr and said, "It seems that way." "Good," said Miss Farr with the practicality of someone who had watched Hannah carry things alone for over a year. "She needs help on this farm, and Lily has already decided she belongs to him." "I don't belong to anyone," said Lily, who was technically napping but had been listening. "You are supposed to be sleeping," said Hannah. "Mason," Lily called out, ignoring her mother entirely, "can we read tonight?" "We can read tonight," Mason said, without turning from his shelf. Lily made a sound of deep satisfaction and presumably returned to napping. Hannah met Miss Farr's eyes across the table, and Miss Farr gave her a look of supreme, telling amusement, and Hannah looked away with the corners of her mouth fighting against themselves. The weeks that followed had the quality that good things have of seeming unremarkable until you are past them and looking back, at which point they reveal themselves as extraordinary. Mason settled into the rhythms of the farm with an ease that surprised him, partly because the work was honest and he had always responded to honest work, and partly because the context, these two people and this land, made every task feel purposeful in a way that nothing had felt purposeful in years. He fixed the schoolhouse roof, because it was genuinely about to fail, and because Lily was going to attend that school in January, and he did not want her attending it under a leaking roof. He did it with Everett Hobbs, whom he had not lost track of after the jail, and who had turned out to be a man with genuine carpenter's skill and a recovering relationship with sobriety. The town found this interesting. A man who had been in the jail fixing the school seemed like some kind of fable. Mason did not feel like a fable. He felt like a man with a hammer and a purpose. He and Hannah fell into the habit of evenings together that were among the richest of his experience. They talked about everything. They talked about books, about the law, about the territory and its politics, and the way the federal government's promises to the peoples already living in these lands had been broken so systematically and completely that the word broken seemed inadequate. Hannah had opinions about this that were careful and informed and morally serious, and he respected her for them. They talked about Missouri and about the mining camp where she had grown up, about the kinds of childhoods that prepared you for this life versus the kinds that only made you believe you were prepared. They argued, once, about the relative merits of the Emily Dickinson poems, and he found the argument delightful because she defended her position with a precision and a passion that he had only seen from her in situations of genuine crisis. And the application of that same energy to a poetry argument was both funny and deeply appealing. Lily continued to be the hinge point of his understanding of what he wanted. He had not expected that. He had expected that his feeling for Hannah would be the primary thing, and that Lily would be an adjunct to it, a factor to be managed. Instead, he found that his relationship with Lily was its own thing, distinct and complete, with its own weight and texture. She was funny in the unconscious way of children who have not yet learned that they are being observed. She was brave in a way that reminded him sometimes of her mother, and sometimes of no one but herself. She tested every person in her environment with an absolute thoroughness, finding out what they were made of, and once she had found out, she was entirely loyal to the verdict. She had found out what he was made of, and she had delivered her verdict, and he was, apparently, hers. He read to her every night. Every single night, regardless of how tired he was, regardless of what had happened in the day. He read her the whole of Grimm's, and when that was done he ordered, through Gerald Potts's newly cooperative general store, a copy of a book called Hans Christian Andersen's Fairy Tales, and he read her that too, story by story, evening by evening, with Hannah at the wood stove or in her chair, or eventually sitting next to him on the settee with her shoulder against his arm, listening. He proposed to Hannah on a night in November. He had planned something more elaborate and then abandoned the elaborateness in favor of honesty, which seemed right for her. They were on the porch as they usually were in the evenings, and Lily was asleep, and the night was cold and clear, and the coyotes were singing their thin, remote songs somewhere in the hills. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I am 31 years old, and I have been running for 9 years, and I came to this town to buy dried beans, and I did not leave because of you and because of Lily," he said. "And I don't want to run anymore. I don't think I can run anymore. And I would like, if you are willing, to be the person who stays here with you, to be your partner on this land, to be a father to Lily if she'll have me, to build something with you." He paused. She had turned to look at him. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "I don't have a ring. I have some legal documents and a horse and a copy of Grimm's Fairy Tales. If that's enough." She looked at him for a long time, long enough that he had time to feel the full weight of the risk he was taking, the old fear, the memory of Tucson, the 9 years of careful self-protection. He sat with it. He did not look away. "It is more than enough," she said. "Yes, I will marry you," he exhaled. She laughed slightly at the exhale. "Were you genuinely worried?" she said. "Yes," he said. "Mason," she said gently, "I have been in love with you since approximately the second story you read my daughter." He stared at her. "You didn't say anything," he said. "You were so determined to be someone passing through," she said, with that slow smile. "I was waiting for you to figure it out yourself." He laughed, which was a sound he had not made in so long that it felt slightly foreign, but good, fundamentally good, like a door opening into a room that had been closed too long and needed only air. He reached across and took her face in both hands and kissed her, and she kissed him back, and the night was cold and full of stars, and the coyotes were still singing, and the land around them was theirs, and the woman in his hands was, impossibly, his, and the girl asleep inside the house was, by the grace of some luck he had not expected and did not deserve, going to be his daughter. They were married in December, in the church with the crooked steeple, by a minister who had come in from Tucson for the month, and who was so moved by the ceremony that he extended his stay by 2 weeks. The whole town came, including Gerald Potts, who brought a canned ham as a gift, and who had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable about the flower incident. Everett Hobbs stood beside Mason as his witness and managed, for the length of the ceremony, to be sober and straight and genuinely happy, which was everything Mason had asked of him. Miss Farr wept quietly and professionally, as schoolteachers do. Lily wore her best dress and stood beside her mother and held both their hands during the parts of the ceremony where hands were available to be held. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, she said, in a stage whisper that reached the back pew, "Does that mean he stays forever?" "Forever," Mason whispered back, and she beamed with a completeness and a confidence that left no room for qualification. The town softened around them over the winter. People who had been uncertain about Hannah's ability to hold the farm, and uncertain about the stranger who had appeared and stayed, came to understand that what had settled in the Crawford place, which was now the Dade place on the deed though Hannah kept her name in daily use as Hannah Crawford Dade, was not precarious but durable. Mason knew the land and the law and the work. Hannah knew everything else. Together they were formidable in the quiet, unglamorous way of people who simply know what they are doing. Lily started school in January and came home every day with stories that she then required Mason to top with stories from the Anderson book, a competition she took very seriously and which he enjoyed enormously. She was, Miss Farr reported, remarkably good with letters, which Mason took responsibility for internally, because he had been reading to her for 3 months before she started school, and he believed those months had given her something, a sense of the shape of stories, the architecture of how words worked together, that served her now. In March, the cottonwood by the creek put out its first leaves, and Mason, who had been watching for them, brought Lily out to see them and explained what a cottonwood was, and why it mattered, the way it marked water, the way the earliest peoples of this land had known to look for it in desert crossings. He was careful when he spoke to her about the peoples of this land, careful to be accurate and respectful, because these were not abstractions to him. He had ridden through enough of the territory to understand the human cost of how the West had been won, and he wanted Lily to grow up understanding it too. She took everything in with those enormous eyes and filed it all away, and returned to him a week later with 2 more questions for everything he'd told her, which seemed exactly right. In April, Hannah told him she was pregnant. She told him in the morning in the kitchen, while he was pulling on his boots, and she said it straight out in the way she said everything, without preamble or performance, just the fact, and then her eyes watching him to see what he did with it. He looked up from his boot. He sat very still for a moment. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am," she said. He stood up from the chair and crossed the kitchen and took her in his arms, and she put her head against his shoulder, and for a long time neither of them spoke, just standing in the kitchen in the morning light with the sounds of the farm outside and Lily still asleep in her room. And he held her, and she held him, and he felt something complete itself in him, some circuit that had been broken for 9 years closing quietly, without fanfare, with the gentleness of inevitability. "Are you happy?" she asked into his shoulder. I don't have a word for this, he said. Happy seems too small. She tilted her head back to look at him. Her eyes were bright, not with tears but with the particular illumination of a person who has just done a thing that makes the whole preceding difficulty make sense. He kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then her mouth slowly, with all the tenderness he had been learning how to feel again over the past months. We have to tell Lily, she said. She's going to want to name it, he said. She is absolutely going to want to name it, Hannah agreed. Lily, when told, made exactly the sounds they expected. A high sustained shriek of pure delight followed by immediately practical questions about logistics, specifically whether the baby would share her room, whether it would be allowed to touch her cloth doll, and what kinds of names were available. She had, it turned out, been thinking about baby names for some time, a list that included several she had encountered in the fairy tales, which Mason gently suggested might cause the child some difficulty in practical life, and several she had invented herself, which were genuinely interesting. I want it to be a boy, she announced. We don't get to choose, Hannah said. I know that, Lily said, with the tone of someone who has been dealing with adults' literal mindedness her whole life. I said I wanted it to be. I didn't say I was choosing it. What would you name a boy? Mason asked. She thought about this very seriously. William, she said, after the story about the boy who found the key. Hannah and Mason looked at each other over Lily's head, with an expression that was part shared amusement, and part shared wonder, and part the particular private language of two people who have built something together, and are beginning to understand its dimensions. The summer was the best of Mason Dade's life. He would have said this was not possible, because he had not previously believed that a settled life, a rooted life, could be anything other than a constraint, something you chose when adventure failed. He understood now that this was the fear talking, the damage talking, the long shadow of Tucson and Clara, and 9 years of making sure nothing could get close enough to hurt him. What he had instead of constraint was weight, real weight, the kind that doesn't pull you down but holds you in place against the wind. He had the farm and the work and the land that he was learning the way you learn a person, slowly and deeply, finding its moods and its particulars. He had Lily, who was 7 now and had her first real chapter book, and was reading with a fluency that made Miss Farr write to the territorial school, bored about the potential for advanced instruction. He had Hannah, who was 8 months pregnant, and who moved through her days with the particular authority of a woman who is absolutely sovereign over her circumstances, and refuses to be diminished by any of them, including the considerable physical demands of carrying a child in the Arizona summer heat. He loved her in the way you love someone after the initial fire has settled and burned down to coals, the deep and sustainable warmth of it, the love that is not about drama or longing but about choosing, every day, to be the person who knows another person completely, and finds that knowledge not diminishing but remarkable. He knew how she took her coffee and how she argued and how she read and how she laughed and how she grieved and how she was brave and how, occasionally, rarely but genuinely, she was afraid. He knew that she talked to the chickens when she thought no one was listening, and that she had memorized several Emily Dickinson poems, and could sometimes be heard reciting one quietly to herself while she worked. He knew that she kept a small wooden box under the bed that had been Daniel's, and that she opened it sometimes, not out of lingering longing but out of the honest preservation of a life that had been real and important and was past. He did not mind the box. He understood it. A person's history was not competition. It was context. It was the reason they were who they were, and he had found every version of Hannah Crawford that had existed before he arrived here to be someone worth respecting. He told her once on the porch that he thought about the way their lives had run in parallel and separate for so many years. Two people who could have been anywhere but who had ended up here in this valley at this point. "Daniel brought me here," she said. "And Lily." "And Dorado's stone bruise," he said, and she laughed. "And a sack of flour you were going to leave in the street," she said. "I was going to leave it in the street." "You were never going to leave it in the street." He thought about that. "No," he said, "probably not." The baby came on an August evening when the heat had finally broken, and a rare rain was coming down, steady and soaking, on the red rock and the cottonwoods, and the creek that had been running low all summer and now ran with renewed voice. Hannah labored with the midwife who came out from town, and Mason sat outside the bedroom door with Lily pressed against his side and read to her in a low voice, not because she needed the story, but because they both needed something to do with their hands and their hearts while the incomprehensible drama of new life proceeded beyond the door. He read her the story of the fisherman's wife, which had been one of the first ones, and Lily, who had heard it many times now, said the lines along with him under her breath, half memorized, and he thought there were very few things in this world as good as this. A child memorizing the stories you read her, carrying them forward, making them part of herself. At 9 o'clock the door opened, and the midwife, a competent and unsentimental woman named Mrs. Prout, leaned out and said, "You have a boy." Lily made a sound that could only be described as triumphant. Mason stood up and went in, and there was Hannah, exhausted and vital and utterly herself, holding a small red-faced bundle of brand-new humanity with an expression on her face that was beyond any category he had language for. And the baby was a boy, absolutely a boy, with Mason's dark coloring and a ferocious, indignant expression as though he had opinions about having arrived and was not yet prepared to share them. "Hello," Mason said to the baby, which was not what he had planned to say but seemed correct. Hannah looked up at him. She was so tired she was nearly transparent, and she was the most beautiful person he had ever seen. "He is extremely unhappy," she said of the baby. "He seems like he has a great deal to say." "He'll fit right in," Mason said. Lily appeared around his elbow, craning to see. "He is very small," she said, with the tone of someone revising a prior estimate downward. "You were very small," Hannah said. "You were smaller." Lily considered this philosophically. "William," she said, reaching out one finger to touch the baby's fist. "Hello, William." The baby, perhaps responding to the certainty in her voice, opened his fist and grabbed her finger. Lily looked up at Mason with an expression of pure, overwhelmed awe. "He knows me," she said. "He knows you," Mason said. He put his arm around Hannah's shoulders, and she leaned into him, and Lily held the baby's hand, and the rain came down outside, and the lamp burned warm. And the story that had begun with a man trying to buy dried beans and leave town, before anyone learned his name, arrived at this moment, which was not an end but a fullness, a place where the shape of a life becomes visible. Autumn came again, and with it the first anniversary of Mason's arrival in Redemption Creek, a fact that Lily marked with a solemnity that suggested she had been saving it. She came to him in the morning while he was bringing in wood for the stove and said, "It has been 1 year." "Since what?" He said, knowing. "Since you came," she said. "Since you read me the first story." He set down the wood and crouched to her level. She was 7, and she was serious about this, the way she was serious about things that mattered. "I remember," he said. "Do you know why I asked you to read to me that first day?" she asked. He shook his head. "Because you had the book," she said. "But also because you looked sad, and in all the stories the people who are sad at the beginning become happy at the end." He looked at her. This child, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's steadiness, and some third quality that was entirely her own, a quality of direct and fearless perception, that he had seen in her from the first morning when she had called out from the porch and asked his horse's name. "Are you happy at the end?" she asked. "I'm not at the end," he said. "I'm in the middle, which is better." She thought about this for a moment, head tilted. "Does the sad part still hurt sometimes?" she asked. He thought about Tucson. He thought about Clara. He thought about the 9 years on the road, and the things he had not been able to give himself, and the long discipline of not letting anything matter. "Less and less," he said. "Every day, a little less." She nodded, satisfied with this answer, and held her arms out for a hug, which he gave her completely, holding the small, certain weight of her. "Good," she said into his shoulder. "Because you are supposed to be happy. It is a rule." "Whose rule?" he said. "Mine," she said, and pulled back and looked at him with an expression that was so entirely Hannah that he had to laugh. "And Mama's. We agreed." He stood up and picked up the wood and carried it inside, and the morning was clear and cold and blue-skied, and the land spread out around the house in every direction. Theirs, known and worked and loved. Hannah was feeding William in the kitchen, and she looked up when Mason came in, and their eyes met across the room in the shorthand of people who have learned each other thoroughly. And he saw in her face the same thing he felt in his chest, the dailiness of it, the realness of it, the fact of a life that kept being lived and kept being good. "Lily tells me we agreed I should be happy," he said. "We did agree that," Hannah said, "unanimously." He set down the wood and came to her and kissed her head and looked at the baby, who was looking at the ceiling with the focused attention of a person for whom the ceiling is the most interesting thing that has yet been presented. "Hello, William," he said. The baby turned his head toward the sound of his voice, which was a new thing, a recent development that Mason found staggeringly moving every time it happened, that this small person already knew the sound of him. "He knows your voice," Hannah said. "Lily tells me he knows people," Mason said. "He does," Hannah said. "He is his father's son." He looked at her. There was a warmth in the word father that still did something to him, even after months of it, even after it had become simply true and daily, it still reached in and touched something. "His father," he said. "His father," she said, quietly and certainly. He thought about running. He thought about 9 years of it, the way it had felt necessary, the way it had felt like survival, and then like habit, and then like something he was doing not because it kept him safe, but because he had forgotten how to stop. He thought about the man he had been in that jail cell 3 weeks into his stay in Redemption Creek, pressed against the wall with a gun at his temple, choosing in the span of a breath not to fight and not to run, because the thing that had stopped him was not the gun. It was never the gun. It was a woman in a doorway, asking him to come back to a child who had asked for him. It was 2 people who had let him matter to them before he had figured out how to prevent it, which was the only way it could have happened, because he had been too well defended for a frontal approach. Love had come at him sideways, through a 6-year-old girl with a cloth doll and enormous eyes, who had simply assumed he was trustworthy and acted accordingly, until it became true. And Hannah. Hannah, who had never pretended, never performed, never offered him anything other than exactly what she was. Hannah, who had read the law books to fight her own battle, and who had come to the jail not because she needed him, though she did, but because her daughter needed him, which was different, which was the distinction that had cracked him open. Hannah, who had told him, on the porch in the dark, that she'd been in love with him since the 2nd story, and had simply waited for him to get there himself. He pulled a chair over and sat beside her while she fed the baby, and he opened the Grimms on the table, not for any particular reason, just the habit of it, the comfort of it. He turned the pages slowly, looking at the stories he knew so well now, the ones Lily had mapped onto her imagination and that would be there for her all her life, the the shapes of things, the patterns. Courage and kindness, and the truth that the person who seems like the least promising character in the story frequently turns out to be the essential one. "Raid one," Hannah said. He looked up. She was watching him over the baby's head, that particular watching she did, taking things in. "To you," he said. "To both of us," she said. He turned to a page. He found a story he liked about a traveler who kept giving things away on his journey, his bread, his cloak, his last coin, and who arrived at the end of the road with nothing and found everything. He read it slowly, the way his mother had taught him, with the voices and the weight. The baby nursed and then slept. The kitchen was warm. Outside, Lily was still talking to Biscuit with the confident certainty of a child who is fully home in her world. The autumn light came through the window and lay in strips across the table, across the old book, across Mason Dade's hands, which were no longer the hands of a man who was leaving. He finished the story and closed the book. Hannah was quiet for a moment. "Good ending," she said. "Yes," he said. "He kept giving things away," she said, "and he got them all back, multiplied." Mason looked at her and felt the truth of it settle in his chest, quiet and permanent, the kind of truth that does not require defending. "That is exactly how it works," he said. She shifted the sleeping baby and reached her free hand across the table. He took it. Her hand was warm and her grip was certain, and her dark eyes held his with the directness he had fallen in love with, that absolute refusal to look away from what was real. The ranch belonged to them. The land belonged to them. The children, the growing family, the evenings, the mornings, the work and the stories and the years that were coming, all of it was theirs. Not without hardship, because hardship was the texture of life in this territory and in any life honestly lived. But with each other, which was enough, which was more than enough, which was everything. He held her hand. The baby slept. Lily's voice came in from outside, happy and continuous, telling Biscuit about the year that had passed and all the things she had learned. And Mason Dade, who had been drifting for 9 years and had stopped the day a woman asked him to read her daughter a story, sat in the kitchen of his home in the November light and was, entirely and without reservation, exactly where he was supposed to be.